The millionaire humiliated the nurse in anger, until he discovered she was his first love forever. Before we explore all the details of this incredible story, tell us where you're following us from and the time. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a thing, and let's embark on this journey together. Some nights the hospital feels like the center of the universe. Anathalie Collins adjusted her stethoscope as she walked down the sterile hallway of Mount Sinai Medical Center. At 27, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to find strength in service to others. Her rich mahogany skin seemed to glow even under the harsh fluorescent lights, and her natural hair was pulled back in a neat bun that showcased the elegant curve of her neck. She wore simple gold studs, her grandmother's, that caught the light when she turned her head to check patient charts. The navy blue scrubs couldn't hide her graceful movements or the way she instinctively slowed her pace when passing worried families in the waiting area. Her warm brown eyes, flecked with amber, had a way of making patients feel seen, understood, even in their most vulnerable moments. "Collins, we need you in Trauma 3, called Dr. Martinez from behind the nurse's station. His voice carried the familiar urgency that had become the soundtrack of Anathalie's life over the past 4 years. She quickened her pace, her comfortable sneakers silent against the polished floor. Trauma nights were when she felt most alive, most needed. Growing up in a modest apartment in Brooklyn with her single mother, a home health aide, Anathalie had learned early that healing came in many forms. Sometimes it was medicine, sometimes it was simply holding someone's hand when they were afraid. The trauma bay buzzed with controlled chaos. A businessman in an expensive suit had been brought in after a car accident, conscious but agitated, his silver hair disheveled, his usually perfect appearance marred by a cut across his forehead. "Where's the doctor?" the man demanded, his voice sharp with authority and pain. "I don't have time for this incompetence." Anathalie approached with her usual calm demeanor, checking his vitals on the monitor. "Sir, Dr. Martinez is reviewing your x-rays. Your blood pressure is elevated, which is normal given the circumstances, but I need you to try to stay calm." "Calm?" The man's blue eyes flashed with irritation. "Do you have any idea who I am? I have a board meeting at 7 a.m. This is—" "Sir, you've been in a serious accident," Anathalie interrupted gently but firmly. "Right now your health is the only priority." She began cleaning the cut on his forehead with practiced precision. This close she could see he was probably in his mid-30s, with strong features and an undeniably handsome face, even twisted with anger. There was something familiar about the set of his jaw, the way his eyes narrowed when frustrated, but she pushed the thought away. New York was full of people who reminded you of someone else. "Don't patronize me, nurse," he snapped. "I've seen how this place operates, slow, inefficient, staffed by people who—" The curtain swept open as Dr. Martinez entered with the x-ray films. Behind him came a woman in an elegant coat, probably the man's assistant or partner. "Mr. Folden," Dr. Martinez began, "the good news is there are no broken bones, but we need to—" "Finally," the man, Folden, interrupted. "Can we expedite this? I have 3 calls with Tokyo that can't wait." Anathalie continued her work, applying antiseptic to his wound with steady hands. But something made her pause. Folden. Sergio Folden. The name echoed in her mind like a half-remembered song. "Sir, you're going to need stitches," she said quietly, preparing the suture kit. "Then get someone who knows what they're doing," Sergio snapped, his voice growing louder. "I don't have time for amateur hour. Do you people understand what efficiency means?" The words hit Anathalie like a slap. Around them, other staff members glanced over, some with sympathetic looks, others with the weary expression of healthcare workers who had heard it all before. "Mr. Folden," Dr. Martinez interjected, "Nurse Collins is one of our most experienced—" "I don't care about her experience," Sergio cut him off, his eyes boring into Anathalie's. "I care about competence, and right now I'm seeing a healthcare system that moves at the speed of molasses while real people have real responsibilities." Anathalie's hands never stopped moving, never shook, even as heat flooded her cheeks. She had been humiliated by difficult patients before, but something about this felt different, personal. The way his voice carried across the trauma bay, ensuring everyone could hear his assessment of her inadequacy. "There," she said quietly, finishing the last stitch. "You're all set. The discharge nurse will give you care instructions." She turned to go, her dignity intact even as her heart hammered in her chest. "And next time," Sergio called after her, loud enough for half the trauma bay to hear, "maybe try to work with a sense of urgency. Some of us have actual important work to do." Anathalie paused at the curtain, her back still turned. For just a moment she considered responding, considered telling this arrogant man exactly what she thought of his important work versus the life-saving work she did every single day. Instead, she took a deep breath and walked away. It wasn't until she was washing her hands at the nurse's station that she heard Dr. Martinez reading the discharge papers aloud. Sergio Anthony Folden, age 36, CEO of Folden Medical Group. Her hands stilled under the warm water. Sergio Anthony Folden, the name she used to write in the margins of her notebooks when she was 16. The boy who had kissed her under the old oak tree behind their high school in Atlanta. The boy who had promised to write, to call, to never forget her when his family moved away. Anathalie closed her eyes and suddenly she was 17 again, watching a silver sedan pull away from the curb, taking with it the boy who had been her first everything, first crush, first kiss, first heartbreak. When she opened her eyes, her reflection in the metal paper towel dispenser showed a woman who had learned to build her life on steadier ground than teenage promises. But her hands were trembling. Behind her she could hear Sergio's voice, still complaining to his companion about the subpar service. The boy who once told her she had the most beautiful smile in the world had just humiliated her in front of her colleagues without even recognizing her face. "You okay, Collins?" asked Janet, the night charge nurse, appearing beside her. Anathalie straightened her shoulders and managed a smile. Just another night in paradise. But as she walked back to check on her other patients, one thought echoed in her mind. Some people change completely, and others, apparently, just become more of what they always were underneath. Should Anathalie give Sergio a second chance after he humiliated her so publicly? Or are some wounds too deep to heal? Sometimes the past doesn't knock. It crashes through your door at 3 a.m. Sergio Folden sat in the leather-back seat of his Tesla Model S, his assistant Delphine typing furiously on her tablet beside him. The city lights of Manhattan blurred past the tinted windows, but his mind wasn't on the upcoming board meeting or the quarterly reports that needed his review. Instead, he kept touching the fresh stitches on his forehead, remembering the gentle, steady hands that had sewn them. "The Tokyo calls are rescheduled for 9 a.m., Delphine said without looking up, her blonde hair perfectly styled despite the late hour. "And I've moved your lunch with the Meridian investors to accommodate the follow-up appointment Dr. Martinez insisted on." Sergio nodded absently, still replaying the encounter at the hospital. Something about that nurse had unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite name. Not her competence. Despite his harsh words, he'd noticed how skillfully she'd worked, how her presence had actually calmed the chaos around them. It was something else, something familiar. "Sir," Delphine's voice cut through his thoughts. "The discharge papers?" He glanced down at the clipboard in his hands, finally focusing on the paperwork he needed to sign. His eyes skimmed over the medical jargon until they landed on a single line that made his blood run cold. "Attending nurse. A. Collins, RN." "Stop the car," he said quietly. "Sir?" "Stop the car, now." The driver pulled over to the curb with smooth precision. Sergio stared at the papers, his mind racing. A. Collins. It couldn't be. After 19 years, in a city of 8 million people, what were the odds? But even as he tried to rationalize it away, images flooded his memory. Anathalie Collins, 16 years old, laughing as she helped him with calculus homework under the old oak tree behind Frederick Douglass High School in Atlanta. Her hair in 2 neat braids, her school uniform always pressed and perfect, her smile brighter than Georgia sunshine. The way she'd listened, really listened, when he talked about his dreams of building something bigger than his father's small medical practice. How she'd believed in him when he was just an angry kid from a family that moved every 2 years for his dad's work. "Anathalie," he whispered, the name feeling foreign and familiar on his lips. "Sir?" Delphine looked concerned. "Are you feeling dizzy? Should we return to the hospital?" Sergio's hands clenched around the papers. The hospital, where he had just humiliated the woman who had been his first everything. His first kiss, his first love, his first broken heart, when his family moved to Boston the summer before senior year. The woman whose last letter he'd never answered because college and ambition had seemed more important than a high school romance. The woman who had just spent 20 minutes carefully stitching his wound while he berated her competence in front of her colleagues. "Jesus," he breathed, running a hand through his silver hair. The irony was devastating. He'd spent 2 decades building a medical empire, becoming exactly the kind of powerful man his teenage self had dreamed of being. And the first time he encountered Anathalie again, he'd used that power to wound her. His phone buzzed with a text from his head of security. "Car accident cleared." Minor injuries only, no media attention needed. But this wasn't about media attention or protecting his reputation. This was about the fact that he'd just destroyed any chance of what? What had he been hoping for all these years when her memory surfaced in quiet moments? "Sir, we really should get you home," Delphine pressed. "You have the Meridian presentation at—" "Cancel everything," Sergio said abruptly. "I'm sorry? Tomorrow. Cancel everything tomorrow." He looked up at her, his blue eyes intense. "And get me everything you can find on the nursing staff at Mount Sinai, specifically anyone named Collins." Delphine's eyebrows rose slightly, but she was too professional to question him. "Of course, sir. Should I—" "Just the employment records. How long they've been there, their background, their story." He paused, realizing how that sounded. "It's not what you think. I need to fix something." The car continued through the nearly empty streets toward his penthouse, but Sergio barely noticed. Instead, he was remembering the way 17-year-old Anathalie had looked at him the night before his family left Atlanta. They'd sat on her front porch swing, her mother's wind chimes creating a gentle melody in the summer air. "Promise me you won't forget," she'd whispered, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Never," he'd sworn, meaning it with every fiber of his teenage heart. "You're going to be part of everything I build, Anna. Everything." But Boston had brought new schools, new opportunities, new people, and gradually the letters had stopped coming. His had stopped too, if he was honest. College applications, then Harvard, then building his first clinic, had consumed everything. Now, nearly 20 years later, he'd found her again, and his first act had been to treat her like she was nothing. The Tesla pulled up to his building, but Sergio didn't move to get out. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, he could see the lights of the city stretching endlessly. Somewhere out there, Anathalie was probably finishing her shift, maybe going home to— what? A husband? Children? A life she'd built without him? The thought made his chest tight with something he hadn't felt in years. Regret. Real, crushing regret. "Sir?" the driver prompted gently. Sergio finally stepped out of the car, but instead of heading to the elevator, he turned back to Delphine. "One more thing," he said. "I want you to send flowers to Mount Sinai, to the trauma nursing staff. Something elegant, with a note apologizing for my behavior tonight." Delphine nodded, making a note on her tablet. What should the card say? Sergio paused, thinking of the boy who used to steal wildflowers from Mrs. Henderson's garden just to see Anathalie smile. That some people deserve better than we give them, and that kindness should never go unrecognized. He headed toward the elevator, then stopped. Make it anonymous. As the elevator carried him up to his empty penthouse, Sergio Folden, CEO, millionaire, man who commanded respect from everyone he met, felt smaller than he had since he was 17 years old, watching Georgia disappear through the rear window of his father's car. But this time, he wasn't going to just disappear. This time he was going to find a way to make things right, even if it took everything he had built to do it. The hardest part about growing up isn't losing your dreams. It's meeting them again when you're no longer the same person. Anathalie's apartment in Harlem was a sanctuary of warm earth tones and carefully curated comfort. Burnt orange throw pillows complemented the deep brown leather couch her mother had helped her pick out 3 years ago, and the walls were adorned with photographs from her travels, a weekend in Martha's Vineyard, her nursing school graduation, her and her best friend Kehlani at a jazz festival in New Orleans. At 6:47 a.m., she finally walked through her front door, her body exhausted but her mind still racing. She dropped her keys in the ceramic bowl by the entrance, a piece she'd made in a pottery class during a rare weekend off, and headed straight for the kitchen. The familiar ritual of making coffee usually calmed her, but today her hands shook slightly as she measured the grounds. Through her kitchen window, she could see the morning sun beginning to paint the brownstones across the street in golden hues, and somewhere in the distance, the city was waking up. But all she could think about was a pair of blue eyes that had once looked at her like she held the secrets of the universe. Her phone buzzed with a text from Kehlani, her college roommate turned lifelong friend. "How was the shift? You're usually home by now." Anathalie stared at the message for a long moment. How could she explain that she'd just spent 20 minutes in close proximity to the boy who had shaped her understanding of love, the boy who had promised her everything and then vanished like morning mist? "Long night. Call you later," she typed back. The coffee finished brewing and she poured herself a large mug, adding just a touch of honey the way her grandmother had taught her. But as she lifted it to her lips, a memory hit her with startling clarity. 17-year-old Sergio sitting in her mother's kitchen, claiming he hated coffee, but accepting a cup anyway because she'd made it. Watching him try not to grimace at the bitter taste while she laughed, eventually adding so much sugar and cream that it barely resembled coffee anymore. "You're going to ruin your sophisticated palate," she'd teased. "I don't need a sophisticated palate," he'd replied, his young face serious in that way that made her heart flutter. "I just need you to keep making it, and I'll learn to love it." Such a small promise, such a meaningful one at the time. Anathalie shook her head, forcing herself back to the present. That boy was gone, replaced by a man who saw her as nothing more than an inconvenient service provider, a man who had publicly questioned her competence without a moment's hesitation. She curled up on her couch, tucking her legs beneath her, and tried to make sense of the night. Part of her wondered if she should have said something, revealed who she was, but what would have been the point? The Sergio Folden of today wasn't the boy who used to walk her home from school every day, carrying her books and listening to her talk about her dreams of becoming a nurse. This Sergio was exactly what she'd expected him to become when she read about his success in business magazines over the years. Cold, calculating, more concerned with efficiency than humanity. The transformation was complete, and somehow that hurt more than his failure to recognize her. Her phone rang, interrupting her brooding. The caller ID showed Mount Sinai's main number. "Anathalie, it's Destiny from Day Shift." The voice belonged to Destiny Moreau, the charge nurse who usually came in as Anathalie's shift ended. "I know you just got home, but I had to call. Someone sent the most incredible flowers to the trauma department this morning." "Flowers?" Anathalie frowned, shifting the phone to her other ear. "Gorgeous white orchids and pale pink roses. The arrangement must have cost a fortune. And get this, the card says they're specifically for the night trauma nursing staff, apologizing for a patient's difficult behavior last night." Anathalie's coffee mug paused halfway to her lips. What did the card say exactly? Something about people deserving better than they sometimes receive, and kindness never going unrecognized. It signed "A Grateful Observer," or something equally mysterious. Destiny's voice carried a note of excitement. "Girl, do you know how rare it is for someone to apologize for being difficult? Usually they just file complaints." "Anonymous flowers," Anathalie murmured, her mind racing. "The arrangement is sitting right at the nurse's station. It's so beautiful that Dr. Reinhold from cardiology asked if he could take a picture for his wife. You should see it when you come in tonight." After hanging up, Anathalie sat in the growing morning light staring at nothing. Anonymous flowers, an apology for difficult behavior. It could have been from any number of patients they'd dealt with last night, but something in her chest told her otherwise. She walked to her bedroom and opened the top drawer of her antique dresser, a piece she'd found at a flea market in Brooklyn that reminded her of her grandmother's furniture. Hidden beneath her passport and other important documents was a small wooden box she hadn't opened in years. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed with time, were the remnants of her teenage romance with Sergio. A movie ticket stub from their first official date, a dried rose from the corsage he'd bought her for homecoming, even though they couldn't afford to go to the dance itself, and at the bottom, a folded piece of notebook paper covered in his 17-year-old handwriting. She unfolded it carefully, though she knew every word by heart. "Anna, I know I'm not good with words like you are, but I need you to know that you're the best thing that's ever happened to me. When I build my empire, and I will build it, you're going to be my queen. We're going to change the world together. I love you more than all the stars in Georgia. Forever yours, S." The note was signed with a little drawing of two stick figures holding hands under a tree. His artistic skills had never matched his ambition. Anathalie traced the faded ink with her finger. She'd been so young, so ready to believe in forever. They both had been, but life had taught her that forever was just another word for until something better comes along. She carefully refolded the note and returned it to the box. Whatever gesture Sergio was making with anonymous flowers, it didn't change the fundamental truth. He had become exactly the kind of man she'd spent her adult life learning to avoid. Powerful, entitled, quick to tear others down to build himself up. The boy who wrote love notes had grown into a man who wielded humiliation like a weapon. But as she finally headed to her bedroom to try to get some sleep, Anathalie couldn't quite shake the memory of how his hands had trembled slightly when she was cleaning his wound, or how, for just a moment when their eyes met, she thought she'd seen something familiar flicker in their blue depths, something that looked almost like recognition. The distance between regret and redemption is measured not in miles, but in the courage to take the first step. 3 days had passed since the flowers arrived at Mount Sinai, and Sergio Folden found himself doing something he hadn't done in over a decade, sitting in his Tesla outside a hospital at 11 p.m., waiting like a nervous teenager. He'd spent those 3 days learning everything he could about Anathalie's life through careful, respectful channels. She worked primarily night shifts in trauma and emergency. She'd graduated from NYU's nursing program with honors. She lived alone in Harlem. No husband, no children that his discreet inquiries had revealed. She was known among her colleagues as someone who stayed late to comfort families, who never missed a shift, who brought homemade soup when her co-workers were sick. Everything he learned made his behavior that night feel worse. Tonight he'd come with a plan, not as Sergio Folden, CEO, but as someone seeking to make a genuine amend. In the passenger seat sat a simple paper bag containing 2 cups of coffee from a 24-hour diner near the hospital. Coffee made exactly the way she used to like it, with just enough cream and sugar to make it palatable. He'd also brought something else, a copy of The House on Mango Street by Sandra Cisneros, the book they'd read together in Mrs. Caldwell's English class. Inside the front cover, he'd written a simple note, "For the girl who taught me that stories matter, and for the woman who reminded me that kindness matters more." But now, sitting here in the darkness, Sergio wondered if this was all a terrible mistake. What if she didn't want to see him? What if his presence only made things worse? His phone rang, startling him from his thoughts. Delphine's name appeared on the screen. "Sir, the Hong Kong investors are still waiting for your response about the merger terms," she said without preamble. "Tell them I'll review it tomorrow," he replied, not taking his eyes off the hospital's employee entrance. "Sir, this is a $40 million deal. They need an answer by—" "Delphine." His voice was gentle but firm. "Some things are more important than money." There was a pause on the other end. In the 3 years she'd worked for him, he'd never said anything like that. "Of course, sir. Should I reschedule your morning meetings as well?" "Yes. Clear my schedule until noon." He ended the call just as the employee entrance opened and a familiar figure emerged. Even from this distance, even in the dim parking lot lighting, he recognized her immediately. The graceful way she moved, the careful attention she paid to her surroundings. Everything about her was exactly as he remembered, yet transformed by the years into something even more beautiful. Anathalie walked toward the employee parking area, her nurse's bag slung over her shoulder, her natural hair now loose around her shoulders in soft curls that caught the light from the street lamps. She looked tired but content, the way someone looks after a job well done. Sergio stepped out of his car before he could lose his nerve. "Anathalie." She froze, then turned slowly. In the space between the streetlights, her face was partially shadowed, but he could see her eyes widen with recognition and something else. Wariness. "Sergio." Her voice was steady, professional. "What are you doing here?" He suddenly felt like every carefully planned word had evaporated. "I needed to see you, to talk." "At 11:30 at night? In a hospital parking lot?" She shifted her bag to her other shoulder, a subtle defensive gesture. "That seems a little dramatic even for you." The words stung, but he deserved them. "I know how this looks, but I also know that if I tried to approach you during the day, in public, you'd have every right to call security. I still have that right." "You do." He took a half-step closer, then stopped, respecting the distance between them. "Anna, I know who you are. I've known since that night." Her expression didn't change, but he saw her hands tighten slightly on her bag strap. And I've been trying to figure out how to apologize for the last 3 days. How do you say sorry for humiliating someone who—" He paused, searching for the right words. "Someone who once meant everything to you?" A car passed on the street behind them, its headlights briefly illuminating both their faces. In that moment, Sergio saw something flicker in her eyes. Not forgiveness, but curiosity. "The flowers," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "Why anonymous?" "Because I didn't want you to think it was about earning your forgiveness. I wanted it to be about acknowledging that you and your colleagues deserve respect. Period." Anathalie studied his face for a long moment. "You look different," she said finally. "Older, grayer, more wrinkles. Sadder," she corrected quietly. The word hit him harder than any business rival's attack ever had, because it was true. He had become sadder, so focused on building his empire that he'd forgotten what it felt like to simply be happy. "I brought you something," he said, holding up the paper bag. "Coffee, made the way you used to like it. And—" he hesitated, then pulled out the book. "Something else." She looked at the book, and for the first time since he'd approached her, her professional composure cracked slightly. "You remember our English class?" "I remember everything, Anna. That's the problem." A silence stretched between them, filled with the distant sounds of the city and the weight of 19 years of separation. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer. "You hurt me that night, not just with your words, but with who you'd become. I know. The boy I knew would never have spoken to anyone the way you spoke to me. The boy you knew was idealistic and stupid about a lot of things," Sergio said quietly. "But he was right about one thing. You were the best thing that ever happened to him." Anathalie looked down at the book in his hands, then back at his face. "What do you want from me, Sergio?" "I want to earn the right to be in your presence without you looking at me like I'm a stranger," he said honestly. "I want to prove that somewhere underneath the man who humiliated you, there's still a piece of the boy who loved you. But mostly, I want you to know that seeing you again, even under those circumstances, reminded me who I used to be, who I want to be again." She reached out and took the book, her fingers briefly brushing his as she did. The contact lasted only a second, but it sent electricity through him that he hadn't felt in decades. "I need to think about this," she said, tucking the book into her bag. "Of course. And I need time. I'll wait." He handed her the bag with the coffee. "As long as it takes." She accepted the bag, and for just a moment her guard slipped completely. In her eyes he saw the girl who used to save him the last piece of her lunch, who helped him study for tests he'd forgotten about, who believed he could be anything he wanted to be. "The boy I knew," she said softly, "promised me he'd change the world." "He did change it," Sergio replied. "He just forgot to make sure it was for the better." Anathalie nodded once, then walked toward her car. But before getting in, she turned back. "Sergio?" "Yes?" "Don't wait in parking lots anymore. If you want to see me again, do it the right way." As she drove away, Sergio stood alone under the streetlights, feeling more hopeful than he had in years. Because for the first time since that terrible night, Anathalie Collins hadn't told him to stay away forever. She'd told him to do better, and he intended to. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let someone see who you really are, scars, fears, and all. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped under Anathalie's apartment door while she slept after another long shift. When she found it at 2 p.m., her name was written across the cream-colored envelope in handwriting she recognized immediately, even after all these years. Inside, on expensive letterhead that read, Sergio A., folded in understated gold lettering, was an invitation unlike anything she'd ever received. "Dear Anathalie, you told me to do this the right way, so I'm asking properly. Would you have coffee with me? Not as the man who humiliated you, and not as the boy you once knew, but as someone who would very much like the chance to show you who he's trying to become. If you're willing, I'll be at Cafe Luna on 125th Street this Saturday at 3 p.m. It's the little place next to the bookstore with the blue awning. I chose it because it's in your neighborhood on your terms. I'll wait until 4 p.m. and if you don't come, I'll understand. But I hope you will. Respectfully yours, Sergio P.S. I read our book again last night. Mrs. Caldwell would be proud that you became exactly who Esperanza hoped to be, someone who lifts others up." Anathalie read the letter 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of thought. He'd researched cafes in her neighborhood. He'd remembered their English teacher's name. He'd read the house on Mango Street and connected it to her life's work. Most importantly, he'd given her complete control, her neighborhood, her choice, her terms. She folded the letter carefully and placed it on her kitchen counter, where it seemed to draw her eyes every time she passed for the next 4 days. Saturday afternoon found Anathalie standing outside Cafe Luna at 2:58 p.m., wearing a soft lavender sweater that brought out the amber flecks in her eyes and dark jeans that made her feel like herself, not the professional nurse in scrubs, but the woman beneath the uniform. Her hair was twisted into an elegant low bun with a few curls framing her face, and she wore the silver bracelet her mother had given her for her nursing school graduation. Through the window she could see Sergio already seated at a corner table, looking nervous in a way she'd never seen him, not even as a teenager. He wore a simple navy sweater over dark jeans, no tie, no suit, none of the armor of success, just a man waiting to see if someone he'd wronged would give him a chance. Taking a deep breath, Anathalie pushed open the door. He looked up immediately, as if he'd been watching for her, and the relief that flooded his face was unmistakable. He started to stand, then seemed to catch himself and waited for her to approach. "You came," he said quietly as she reached the table. "I almost didn't," she replied honestly, settling into the chair across from him. "What changed your mind?" Anathalie considered the question. Curiosity, I suppose, and I read your note about Esperanza. Mrs. Caldwell always said literature was supposed to change us. I wanted to see if it had changed you. A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. She also said that the best characters were the ones who could admit their mistakes and grow from them. True. Anathalie glanced around the cozy cafe, taking in the local art on the walls and the eclectic mix of neighborhood regulars. You did your homework choosing this place. I asked my driver, Tyrone, where he takes his daughter for coffee when she's home from college. He lives 3 blocks from here. Sergio's hands rested flat on the table, steady but tense. I realized I'd been living in Manhattan for 8 years, and I don't know any neighborhood spots, only corporate restaurants and hotel bars. It was such a small admission, but it spoke volumes about the insular world he'd built around himself. A young barista with intricate braids approached their table. What can I get you folks? Lavender oat milk latte, please, Anathalie said. And for you, sir? Sergio hesitated. Actually, could I get a coffee with cream and sugar? Enough to make it less bitter. Anathalie looked at him in surprise. You still don't like coffee? Never did, but I'm trying to learn. He met her eyes. I figure it's about time I developed some taste for things that are good for me, even if they're not immediately easy. After the barista left, silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, but heavy with unspoken questions. Finally, Sergio spoke. I owe you more than an apology, Anna. I owe you an explanation. I'm listening. He took a breath, and when he began speaking, his voice was different from the commanding tone she'd heard at the hospital. Quieter, more uncertain. After we lost touch, I threw myself into becoming successful with the kind of single-minded focus that, well, that consumed everything else. I told myself I was building something worthy of the girl who believed in me, but somewhere along the way, I started believing that being powerful meant being untouchable. That showing emotion or vulnerability was weakness. The barista returned with their drinks, and Sergio wrapped his hands around his mug like he needed the warmth. I became exactly what my father warned me about, a man so focused on being respected that he forgot how to be decent. He looked up at her. That night at the hospital, I was angry about losing control, about being hurt, about not being the center of attention for 5 minutes. And I took it out on the one person who was actually helping me. Anathalie sipped her latte, studying his face. And you didn't recognize me. Not consciously, but something about you felt... He paused, searching for words. You calmed something in me that's been agitated for years. Even while I was being terrible, part of me kept thinking, who is this woman? And why does being near her feel like coming home? The words hit her harder than she'd expected. Because despite everything, the humiliation, the anger, the years of distance, she'd felt it too. That strange sense of recognition that went deeper than memory. You hurt me, Sergio. Not just that night, but 19 years ago when you disappeared without explanation. I know. His voice was barely above a whisper. I was 18 and stupid and convinced that if I couldn't offer you everything immediately, I shouldn't offer you anything at all. I thought I was protecting you from a long-distance relationship that might hold you back. You thought wrong. I know that now. He leaned forward slightly. Anna, I'm not asking you to forgive me or forget what happened. I'm asking for the chance to show you that the boy you believed in is still here, underneath all the damage I've done to myself. Anathalie set down her cup, her decision crystallizing. What would that look like? Showing me? I don't know yet, he admitted. I just know that for the first time in decades, I want to be better more than I want to be successful, and it started the moment I realized who you were. She studied his face, older, more lined, but with eyes that held an honesty she remembered from their teenage years. Finally, she spoke. I finish my shift Thursday at 7 a.m. If you want to show me who you're trying to become, meet me at Mount Sinai's main entrance. Not as a patient, not as a CEO, but as someone who wants to understand what my world actually looks like. Hope flickered in his expression. You want me to shadow your shift. I want you to see why what you said that night was so wrong. And I want to see if you can handle being in a place where money doesn't matter, where the only thing that counts is whether you can help someone who's hurting. Sergio nodded slowly. Will they let me? I'll arrange it. She stood, gathering her purse. Sergio? Yes? The boy I knew had dreams of building something that mattered. If you want to earn your way back to who you were, you need to remember that healing people is more important than owning the buildings where it happens. As she walked toward the door, Anathalie heard him call softly after her. Anna? She turned. Thank you for giving me a chance to try. And for the first time since that terrible night, Anathalie Collins smiled at Sergio Folden, the way she used to smile at the boy who carried her books and promised to change the world. True character isn't revealed in boardrooms, it's revealed in moments when no one important is watching. At 6:45 a.m. on Thursday, Sergio stood outside Mount Sinai's main entrance wearing scrubs that felt foreign against his skin and a visitor badge that read, S. Folden, Observer, Doctor. Martinez had been surprisingly accommodating when Anathalie explained that a potential medical equipment donor wanted to understand hospital operations from the ground level. Sergio hadn't corrected the assumption. Some things were more important than pride. "You look nervous," Anathalie observed as she approached from the employee entrance. In her navy scrubs and with her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, she looked completely in her element. Confident, purposeful, ready for whatever the night might bring. "I am nervous," he admitted. "I haven't been in a hospital as anything other than a patient or board member in 15 years. "Good. Nervous means you're paying attention." She handed him a small notebook and pen. "You're going to see things tonight that you might not understand. Write them down. Ask questions later, not during critical moments." They walked through the corridors together, and Sergio was immediately struck by the controlled chaos that Anathalie navigated with ease. The sounds were different from his memory, not just the beeping machines and overhead pages, but the murmur of families in waiting areas, the quiet conversations between staff members, the shuffle of feet as people moved through their most vulnerable moments. "First stop," Anathalie said, leading him to the nurses' station. "Meet the team." Destiny Moreau looked up from her computer with a welcoming smile. "So you're our mysterious observer. Anathalie says you're interested in seeing how we really work." "Very interested," Sergio replied, noting how Destiny's eyes crinkled at the corners, the kind of lines that came from smiling at people during their worst days. "This is Bodhi," Anathalie continued, gesturing to a young male nurse with kind eyes who was organizing medication carts. "He's our pediatric specialist. And that's Nalani. She handles our psychiatric evaluations." Nalani, a woman about Anathalie's age with intricate tattoos visible on her forearms, waved without looking up from her charts. "Fair warning, if you're looking to make quick decisions tonight, you're in the wrong place. Everything here takes as long as it takes." The first hour was an education in patience. Sergio watched Anathalie check on an elderly man named Mr. Garrison, who'd been admitted with chest pains but was mostly scared and alone. She didn't just monitor his vitals, she sat beside his bed for 10 minutes, listening to him talk about his late wife and his worry about his cat at home. "Shouldn't someone else be handling the pet situation?" Sergio asked quietly as they walked to the next room. Bodhi already called Mr. Garrison's neighbor. "She's feeding Winston and will bring pictures tomorrow." Anathalie glanced at him. "Fear makes everything hurt worse. Sometimes medicine is about solving the problems that aren't in the chart." In the notebook, Sergio wrote, "Healing, Ksakt, addressing fear, not just symptoms." The night progressed with a steady stream of human need. A teenager brought in after a skateboarding accident, trying to act tough while his worried mother paced the hallway. A construction worker with a dislocated shoulder who kept apologizing for being there because he didn't have good insurance. A young mother whose toddler had a fever that wouldn't break. With each patient, Sergio watched Anathalie become completely present. She explained procedures in words people could understand. She anticipated needs before they were voiced. When the construction worker mentioned his insurance worries, she quietly directed him to a social worker who could help with payment plans. "You memorized everyone's names," Sergio noted during a brief break around 2 a.m. "People need to be seen as individuals, especially when they're at their most vulnerable," Anathalie replied, refilling her water bottle. "Mr. Henderson, the construction worker, he's been putting off medical care for months because of cost. The teenager Kai is here for the 3rd time this year with skating injuries. His mom works 2 jobs and can't always supervise him after school. You know all their stories. Their stories matter. They're not just medical cases, they're people with complicated lives who need healing in more ways than one." Around 3 a.m., everything changed. The ambulance bay doors burst open, and paramedics rushed in with a car accident victim, a woman in her 30s, unconscious, with multiple injuries. The trauma bay exploded into coordinated action that was beautiful and terrifying to watch. Sergio pressed himself against the wall, trying to stay out of the way as Anathalie and the team worked with practiced precision. He'd seen efficiency in boardrooms, but this was different. This was efficiency with soul. Every movement purposeful and urgent, but never panicked. "Talk to me, Collins," Dr. Martinez called out as he worked. BP dropping, possible internal bleeding, pupils reactive but slow. She's fighting us on the intubation, Anathalie responded, her hands steady as she managed IV lines and monitored vitals simultaneously. For 20 minutes, Sergio watched them fight for a stranger's life with the same intensity he'd once seen Anathalie bring to studying for finals. The woman, identified as Lydia Summers, a nurse from a different hospital who'd been driving home from her own night shift, stabilized just enough to be rushed to surgery. Afterward, as the trauma bay was cleaned and reset, Sergio found himself shaking slightly. "You okay?" Anathalie asked, appearing beside him with 2 cups of coffee. "She's someone's daughter, maybe someone's mother," he said quietly. "Lydia has 2 kids, 7 and 9. Her ex-husband is driving down from Albany." Anathalie's voice was gentle but matter-of-fact. "Her surgery will take about 4 hours. Her kids will be here in 3. How do you handle it? Caring about everyone, knowing their stories, and then sometimes losing them anyway." She took a sip of coffee, considering. "I remember why I'm here. I can't control outcomes, but I can control whether people feel alone in their worst moments." Sergio looked at her, really looked, and saw something he'd missed in all his memories of the girl she'd been. The woman Anathalie had become possessed a strength that came from choosing compassion even when it hurt, especially when it hurt. "That night when I was here as a patient," he said slowly, "you were taking care of me the same way you take care of everyone else, even while I was being horrible. It's not about whether someone deserves care, Sergio. It's about whether they need it." As the night wore on, Sergio found himself thinking less about the medical procedures and more about the small moments of connection. Anathalie helping the scared teenager text his girlfriend to let her know he was okay. Bodhi sitting with Mr. Garrison during a particularly bad spell of anxiety. Destiny coordinating with 3 different departments to make sure the construction worker received the care he needed, regardless of his insurance status. By 6 a.m., as the day shift began arriving, Sergio's notebook was full of observations that had nothing to do with medical efficiency and everything to do with human dignity. "So," Anathalie said as they walked toward the exit, "what did you learn?" Sergio stopped walking and turned to face her. "I learned that I've been measuring success all wrong. I thought power meant being able to control outcomes, but you have real power, the power to make people feel less alone. And I learned that the boy who wanted to change the world had the right idea. He just forgot that changing the world happens one person at a time, one moment of compassion at a time." Anathalie studied his face in the early morning light streaming through the hospital windows. Lydia's surgery was successful. She'll recover fully. Relief flooded through him. "How do you know?" "Dr. Chen called down 20 minutes ago. I thought you'd want to know." The fact that she'd thought to tell him that she'd understood he'd become invested in a stranger's outcome meant more than she probably realized. "Anna," he said quietly, "I want to help. Not as a donor or a board member, but how can I help?" She smiled then, the first truly warm smile she'd given him since they'd reconnected. "There are a lot of Mr. Hendersons out there, people who put off medical care because they can't afford it. If you really want to help, find a way to fix that." As they stepped out into the crisp morning air, Sergio realized that for the first time in years, he had a purpose that had nothing to do with profit margins or market dominance. He had work to do, real work. The moment you realize your wealth means nothing if it doesn't serve something greater than yourself, that's when you finally become rich. 2 weeks after shadowing Anathalie's shift, Sergio sat in his corner office overlooking Central Park, but his mind was entirely focused on the proposal spread across his mahogany desk. The letterhead read, "Folden Foundation Healthcare Initiative," and the document outlined something that would have been unthinkable to him a month ago: converting 2 of his most profitable private clinics into sliding-scale community health centers. His assistant Delphine stood across from him, her expression carefully neutral as she waited for his response to the financial projections. "Sir, the board is going to ask about projected losses," she said diplomatically. "Converting the Upper East Side and Midtown clinics would cost approximately $12 million in the first year alone." "And how much did I spend on that yacht I never use?" Sergio asked, without looking up from the documents. $15 million. There's your answer. He signed the proposal with decisive strokes. "Schedule a board meeting for Friday. And Delphine? Cancel the yacht. Sell it." Her eyebrows rose slightly, the most emotion she'd shown in 3 years of working for him. "Sir, are you certain? You said that yacht was your reward for what? For building something that only serves people who already have everything?" Sergio finally looked up at her. I want to build something that matters. This matters. What he didn't tell Delphine was that every decision over the past 2 weeks had been filtered through a simple question. What would Anathalie think? Not because he was trying to impress her, but because her perspective had become his moral compass in ways he was still discovering. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Mr. Henderson's surgery went well. Thought you'd want to know. Sergio smiled, remembering the construction worker whose insurance worries had kept him from seeking care for months. After shadowing Anathalie's shift, Sergio had quietly arranged for Mr. Henderson's shoulder surgery to be covered through an anonymous benefactor program he'd created on the spot. He texted back, "That's wonderful news. Are you free for lunch today? I have something to show you." The response came quickly. "Off at 3. Where?" "Folden Medical Center on 92nd. Ask for me at the front desk. Your clinic." "Sergio, I'm not sure that's—" "Trust me, please." A long pause, then, "Okay, but if this is some kind of grand gesture to impress me, I'm leaving." "It's not a gesture. It's a beginning." At 3:15 p.m., Anathalie walked into the marble lobby of Folden Medical Center, wearing jeans and a soft coral sweater that made her skin glow. Her natural hair fell in loose waves around her shoulders, and she carried herself with the quiet confidence he'd come to associate with her off-duty hours. She looked around the opulent space with obvious discomfort. "This is where you work?" she asked, when Sergio met her at the reception desk. "This is where I used to work," he corrected, leading her toward the elevator. "Come on, I want to show you what it's going to become." They rode up to the 3rd floor in relative silence, and when the elevator doors opened, Anathalie stepped into what looked like a construction zone. Walls were being torn down, new ones going up, and workers moved purposefully through the space with blueprints and measuring tools. "What is this?" she asked, her voice echoing slightly in the partially demolished space. "The future," Sergio said, pulling out a tablet to show her the architectural plans. "Community health center, sliding scale payments, free clinics on Tuesdays and Thursdays, specialists who donate time, everything that Mr. Henderson needed but couldn't access." Anathalie took the tablet from him, scrolling through the detailed plans. Her expression shifted from skepticism to amazement as she absorbed the scope of the project. "Sergio, this is incredible, but the cost is irrelevant." He gestured around the space. "I own 4 clinics in Manhattan. 2 of them served people like us, people who can afford premium healthcare. The other 2 served people like your patients, people who needed care but couldn't always pay for it. And you're converting the profitable ones. I'm converting the ones in neighborhoods that need them most." He pointed to different areas on the blueprints. Pediatric wing here, women's health there, mental health counseling, addiction support services, everything under one roof. Anathalie looked up from the tablet, her eyes bright with something that might have been tears. "Why?" "Because you were right. That night you challenged me to understand your world. I saw what healthcare looks like when it's about healing instead of profit. I saw what you do every day, how you treat people with dignity regardless of whether they can pay." He took a step closer to her. "I want to be part of that world, Anna. Not as an owner or a boss, but as someone who helps make it possible." She walked over to where workers were installing what would become the reception desk. "How many people will this serve?" "The projections estimate about 3,000 patients in the first year, more as word spreads. 3,000 people who might not otherwise have access to care. 3,000 people who deserve to be treated the way you treat everyone, like they matter." Anathalie turned to face him, and in her expression he saw something he hadn't dared hope for. Pride. Not the polite acknowledgement of a good deed, but genuine pride in who he was becoming. "There's more," he said quietly. "I want you to be the director of nursing operations." Her eyes widened. "Sergio, before you say no, hear me out. You know what good healthcare looks like from the ground up. You understand how to build systems that serve people instead of profit margins, and—" He paused, searching for the right words. "I need someone I trust to make sure I don't lose sight of why this matters. I already have a job, one I love." "I know. And you'd keep your position at Mount Sinai. This would be part-time, consulting work. Help us design protocols, train staff, make sure we're doing this right." He gestured around the space. "I can build the infrastructure, Anna, but I need someone who understands the heart of it." She was quiet for a long moment, studying the blueprints again. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft. "The boy I knew in high school, he dreamed of changing the world through medicine, but I always thought he meant making money from it. So did I for a long time. This is what he really meant, isn't it? What we talked about under that oak tree, making healthcare about healing, not wealth. Sergio felt his throat tighten with emotion. You remember that conversation? I remember all of them. She folded the tablet against her chest. You said you wanted to build hospitals where no one would ever be turned away for not having money, where every person would be treated like family. I forgot that dream for a long time. But you found it again. You helped me find it again. They stood in the midst of the construction, surrounded by the sounds of hammering and drilling, and Sergio felt something shift between them. Not forgiveness exactly, but something deeper. Recognition. The recognition that the boy she'd loved was still there, transformed by years and mistakes, but fundamentally unchanged in the ways that mattered most. I'll do it, she said quietly. The consulting position, but I have conditions. Name them. Full transparency. I see all the financials, all the decisions. If this becomes about profit or prestige, I walk. Agreed. And I want input on everything. Staffing, protocols, patient services. This has to be done right. I wouldn't want it any other way. And Sergio, she stepped closer to him, close enough that he could see the amber flecks in her brown eyes. If you hurt me again, professionally or personally, there won't be a third chance. There won't need to be, he said quietly. I'm done being the man who hurts people, especially you. As they walked back through the construction zone toward the elevator, Anathalie paused beside what would become the main waiting area. What will you call it? She asked. Sergio had been thinking about this for days. The Esperanza Community Health Center. Esperanza, hope, and after a character who understood that sometimes you have to leave where you came from to become who you're meant to be. Anathalie smiled then, the full, radiant smile he remembered from their teenage years. Mrs. Caldwell would love that. As the elevator carried them down to the lobby, Sergio realized that for the first time since Anathalie had walked back into his life, she was looking at him not with wariness or careful hope, but with something that looked remarkably like the way she used to look at him when they were 17 and believed they could change the world together. Maybe, he thought, they still could. Love isn't always a lightning strike. Sometimes it's a slow sunrise, warming everything it touches until you realize the whole world has changed. 3 weeks into the Esperanza project, Anathalie found herself looking forward to her Tuesday and Thursday consulting sessions in ways that had nothing to do with the work itself. Though the work was extraordinary, designing patient flow systems, interviewing potential staff, creating protocols that prioritize dignity alongside efficiency, it was the hours spent collaborating with Sergio that had begun to feel like coming home. Today they sat in the temporary office space he'd set up in the building's former conference room, surrounded by architectural plans, staffing charts, and 2 lukewarm cups of coffee that had been forgotten during an intense discussion about pediatric care accessibility. What if we partnered with the school district? Anathalie suggested, pointing to the demographic charts spread across the table. Mobile health units that visit schools in underserved areas. Catch problems early, provide immunizations, basic care that kids might not otherwise receive. Sergio looked up from his laptop, where he'd been calculating costs. That's brilliant. How would the logistics work? We'd need specially equipped vehicles, probably 2 to start. Rotating schedule between 6 schools. Staff each unit with a nurse practitioner, a medical assistant, and a social worker. Social worker? Sergio, when a 7-year-old comes in with recurring stomach aches, sometimes the problem isn't medical, it's that there's no food at home. We need people who can connect families with resources. He leaned back in his chair, studying her face. You've thought about this before. For years, I've written proposals, made presentations to hospital boards. They always say it's too expensive, too complicated, too risky. She gestured around the room. But this is different. You're different. How so? Anathalie considered the question, her eyes taking in the man across from her. Over the past month, she'd watched Sergio transform not just his business practices, but his entire approach to life. Gone were the sharp suits and imperial demeanor. Today he wore dark jeans and a soft grey Henley that made his blue eyes seem warmer, and his silver hair was slightly mussed from running his hands through it while concentrating. More importantly, she'd seen him listen, really listen, to the construction workers when they suggested design improvements. She'd watched him spend an hour on the phone with a potential staff member who was nervous about leaving private practice for community health work, not selling or pressuring, but genuinely understanding their concerns. The boy I knew dreamed big, but thought small, she said finally. You dream big and think bigger. You see problems and immediately start figuring out solutions instead of reasons why something can't work. Is that good or bad? She paused, realizing the truth as she spoke it. It's exactly what I fell in love with 19 years ago. Except now you have the resources and experience to actually make it happen. The words hung in the air between them, more honest than she'd intended to be. They'd been careful to keep their interactions professional, focused on the work, but the underlying current of their history was always there, growing stronger with each shared success. Sergio set down his pen and looked at her directly. Anna, can I ask you something? Of course. That last night before my family moved to Boston, do you remember what we talked about? She remembered everything about that night. The summer air, thick with humidity and promises. The way he'd held her hand like he was trying to memorize the feeling. The tears neither of them had wanted to shed. You said we'd find our way back to each other, she replied quietly. That some things were meant to be, even if the timing was wrong. I meant it. Every word. I know you did. We both did. And now? The question was simple, but it carried the weight of everything they'd been carefully not discussing. Anathalie looked around the room where they'd spent so many hours planning something beautiful together, then back at his face. Now I'm scared, she admitted. Of what? Of wanting something I already lost once. Of believing in promises that disappeared before. She took a breath. Of falling in love with you again and finding out it's just nostalgia dressed up as hope. Sergio stood up and walked around the table to where she sat. He didn't try to touch her, but he was close enough that she could see the sincerity in his expression. Anna, I can't promise I won't make mistakes. I can't promise I won't sometimes be the stubborn, focused man who gets lost in his work. But I can promise you this. I will never again be the man who walks away without fighting for what matters most. And what matters most? You. This work we're doing together. The life we could build if you're brave enough to trust me with your heart again. Before she could respond, a knock on the door interrupted them. Bodhi from Mount Sinai peeked his head in, wearing a broad grin. Sorry to interrupt, but I had to see this place for myself, he said, stepping into the room. Anna talks about it constantly. Sergio thinks we should try this. Sergio suggested that. Girls got it bad. Bodhi, Anathalie protested, heat flooding her cheeks. What? It's true. You've been different these past few weeks. Happier. Like you're finally working on something that uses all of who you are, instead of just your nursing skills. Sergio extended his hand to Bodhi. You must be the pediatric specialist Anna's told me about. I was hoping we could convince you to consult on our children's programs. Already ahead of you, Bodhi replied, shaking his hand. Anna sent me the proposal last week. I'm in. This is exactly the kind of work I went into nursing to do. As Bodhi began examining the pediatric wing blueprints, asking detailed questions about everything from play areas to family consultation rooms, Anathalie watched Sergio interact with her colleague. He listened intently, asked thoughtful questions, and immediately began incorporating Bodhi's suggestions into the plans. You know what the best part is, Bodhi said, as he prepared to leave an hour later. This doesn't feel like charity. It feels like justice, making healthcare available to everyone, the way it should be. After he left, Anathalie and Sergio continued working, but the earlier conversation lingered between them. As the afternoon stretched into evening, their professional collaboration began to feel more and more like something deeper. Two people building not just a health center, but a shared vision of what the world could look like. Anna, Sergio said as they were packing up for the day, would you like to have dinner? Not for the project, just because I'd like to spend more time with you. She looked at him, really looked, and saw the 17-year-old boy who used to walk her home every day, mixed with the man who was using his resources to heal the world. The combination was irresistible. Yes, she said simply, I'd like that. As they walked out of the building together into the warm evening air, Anathalie realized that somewhere between arguing about patient privacy protocols and designing children's examination rooms, she'd stopped thinking of Sergio as her past and started seeing him as her possible future. And for the first time in 19 years, that future looked bright enough to chase. There's a little Ethiopian place 2 blocks from here, she suggested. Family-owned, amazing food, and they know me well enough to give us a quiet table. Perfect, Sergio replied, and the way he said it made her believe that maybe, just maybe, it really could be. The most dangerous moment in falling in love again isn't the first kiss. It's the first time you let yourself imagine a future together. Zara's Ethiopian kitchen was exactly as Anathalie had described, warm, intimate, and filled with the rich aromas of Berber spice and honey wine. The owner, Zara herself, greeted Anathalie with the enthusiasm reserved for family and showed them to a corner table adorned with traditional woven placemats and soft candlelight. "The usual?" Zara asked with a knowing smile. "Actually, make it the chef's choice for two," Anathalie replied. "And bring us some teji, if that's okay with you," she added, looking at Sergio. "I trust your judgment," he said, and something about the way he said it made it clear he wasn't just talking about the food. As Zara bustled away, they found themselves truly alone together for the first time since that coffee shop meeting weeks ago. Without the buffer of work talk or the bustle of the construction site, the air between them seemed charged with possibility and the weight of their shared history. "I have a confession," Sergio said, fidgeting with his water glass. "I've been to every Ethiopian restaurant in Manhattan over the past year, trying to find one that felt like the place you used to describe in your letters." Anathalie's eyebrows rose. "My letters? You wrote about your college roommate, Kaylani, taking you to this hole-in-the-wall Ethiopian place near campus. You said the injera bread reminded you of your grandmother's cornbread, completely different ingredients, but the same feeling of home." She stared at him. "Sergio, that was one line in one letter 20 years ago. I remember everything you wrote to me." His voice was quiet, almost embarrassed. "Every letter, every postcard, every small detail about your life. I kept them all." "You kept them?" The question came out as barely a whisper. "They're in a box in my study, tied with the same blue ribbon you used on the last one." He looked down at his hands. "When I moved to Boston, then to Harvard, then to New York, I carried them with me everywhere. They were the only real thing I had." Anathalie felt her chest tighten. "Then why did you stop writing back?" "Because I was a coward." The words came out raw, honest. "Because every letter you sent made me miss you more, and I convinced myself that missing you was keeping me from becoming the man I needed to be to deserve you. That wasn't your choice to make. I know that now. I know a lot of things now that I was too young and stupid to understand then." Zara arrived with a traditional coffee ceremony set up and 2 glasses of golden tej, giving them a moment to let the weight of Sergio's confession settle between them. "Tell me about your life," he said finally. "The real version, not the professional highlights I could find online. What makes you laugh? What keeps you up at night when you're not working? What do you dream about?" Anathalie sipped the honey wine, feeling its warmth spread through her chest. "You really want to know?" "I want to know everything." So she told him. About her friendship with Kaylani, who'd become a pediatrician in New Orleans and still called every Sunday to check in. About her mother, who'd remarried a gentleman named Terence and now lived in a little house in Decatur, with a garden that produced more tomatoes than any 2 people could eat. About her pottery classes and how she discovered that working with clay helped her decompress after difficult shifts. "I have a studio apartment full of ceramic bowls I'll never use," she admitted with a laugh. "But there's something about creating something beautiful with your hands after spending your nights dealing with broken things." "I'd like to see them sometime," Sergio said. "Your bowls. They're not very good. I bet they're perfect." The food arrived, a colorful array of stews and vegetables on a platter-sized piece of injera bread. As they ate with their hands, the traditional way something intimate and playful emerged between them. Sergio struggled with the etiquette at first, making Anathalie laugh when he tried to use a fork, before she gently guided his hands to tear the bread properly. "Like this," she said, her fingers covering his as she showed him how to scoop up the spicy lentils. The contact was brief, practical, but it sent electricity through both of them. "You know," Sergio said as he successfully managed a bite without dropping anything, "I had this fantasy in college." "Oh?" Anathalie's voice carried a note of amusement. "Not that kind of fantasy," he said, laughing. "I used to imagine taking you to dinner somewhere exotic and sophisticated. I thought I'd impress you with my worldliness and knowledge of fine cuisine. And instead, I'm teaching you how to eat with your hands in a neighborhood restaurant." "It's perfect," he said, and the sincerity in his voice made her heart skip. "This is better than any fantasy I ever had." As the evening progressed, they talked about everything and nothing. He told her about his travels, business trips that took him to beautiful places he never really saw because he was always focused on the next meeting, the next deal. She told him about her volunteer work at a literacy program, teaching adults to read, and how one of her students had just gotten her GED at age 55. "What scares you?" she asked, as they shared a piece of honey cake for dessert. The question caught him off guard. "Besides losing you again." "Besides that," he considered for a moment. "Mediocrity. Not the professional kind. I've never worried about being successful. But the kind where you look back on your life and realize you never actually mattered to anyone, that you built impressive things but never touched anyone's heart. And what gives you hope? This. He gestured between them. Working with you on Esperanza. Watching you fight for people who can't fight for themselves. Feeling like I might actually be becoming someone worthy of the faith you used to have in me. When Zara brought them coffee and declined payment, friends of Anna eat free tonight, they found themselves reluctant to leave the warm cocoon of the restaurant. Walk with me, Sergio asked as they stepped out onto the sidewalk. They strolled slowly through Harlem's evening rhythms, past brownstones with lights glowing in windows, past the occasional couple walking hand in hand, past the sounds of music and laughter drifting from open doors. The city felt different when you weren't rushing through it, Nathalie realized. Gentler, more full of possibility. "Can I ask you something?" she said, as they paused at a corner to wait for the light. "Anything. What do you see when you look at me now? Not who I was, but who I am today." Sergio stopped walking and turned to face her fully. The streetlight caught the amber flecks in her eyes and highlighted the elegant curve of her neck. But it was more than her physical beauty that made his breath catch. "I see someone who chose a profession where she heals people every day, even when it's thankless and exhausting. I see someone who remembers the names and stories of every patient because she understands that being seen matters more than being fixed. I see someone who took a chance on a man who humiliated her because she believes in second chances more than she believes in grudges." He paused, his voice growing softer. "And I see the girl who taught me what love could feel like, grown into a woman who shows me what love should look like." The words hung between them in the warm evening air. Nathalie felt her walls, carefully constructed over years of protecting herself from disappointment, beginning to crumble. "Sergio, I know it's too soon to say things like that. I know I have to earn the right to be part of your life again. But Anna, I need you to know that this isn't nostalgia or some midlife crisis. This is me recognizing that the best thing that ever happened to me just walked back into my life, and I'm not going to be stupid enough to let her walk away again." They had reached her building. The evening was ending, but neither of them wanted to break the spell that had settled over them. "I had a good time tonight," she said, her hand resting on the door handle. "So did I. The best time I've had in about 19 years. She smiled at the full, radiant smile that had been haunting his dreams since they were teenagers. "Good night, Sergio." "Good night, Anna." But as she turned to go inside, he called her name softly. "Anna?" "Yes? I know you're scared. I'm scared too. But maybe being scared together is better than being safe apart." As she climbed the stairs to her apartment, Nathalie carried those words with her like a promise. And for the first time since Sergio Folden had walked back into her life, she let herself imagine what it might feel like to stop being afraid and start being brave. The moment you realize you're brave enough to be broken again is the moment you become strong enough to be whole. The call came at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, jarring Nathalie from deep sleep. Sergio's name on her phone screen made her heart race, not with the flutter of new romance, but with genuine fear. He never called this late. "Anna." His voice was shaky, wrong. "Can you come? I'm at Mount Sinai." "What happened?" She was already reaching for clothes, her nurse's instincts kicking in. "My father. Heart attack. They brought him in 20 minutes ago." A pause, and then, more quietly, "I can't. I need someone who understands this place. I need you. I'm on my way." Nathalie dressed quickly and caught a taxi to the hospital, her mind racing. In all their conversations about the past, Sergio had mentioned his father only in passing, the doctor whose constant moving had shaped his childhood, whose approval had always seemed just out of reach. She found him in the cardiac unit waiting area, still in pajama pants and a hastily thrown-on sweater, his silver hair disheveled. He looked younger than she'd seen him since they'd reconnected, and more vulnerable. "Hey," she said softly, settling into the chair beside him. "Hey." He reached for her hand without thinking, and she let him take it. "Thank you for coming. How is he?" "Surgery. They said it was massive. Triple bypass. Maybe more." His voice cracked slightly. "Anna, we haven't spoken in 2 years. Not since I told him I was converting the clinics to community health centers. He said I was throwing away everything he'd built." Nathalie squeezed his hand. "Tell me about him." "Dr. Harrison Folden, 68 years old, stubborn as hell, and..." Sergio's voice caught. "And the man who taught me that medicine was supposed to be about helping people. Before I forgot. Before I became someone he couldn't recognize. He's going to be okay," she said, not because she knew it was true, but because Sergio needed to hear it. He was proud of me once, when I graduated medical school, when I opened my first clinic, but somewhere along the way, I became more interested in expanding than healing, and he called me out on it, said I'd lost my soul to my ambition. Is that why you were so angry that night when you came to the ER, when you humiliated me? Sergio turned to look at her, confusion in his eyes. What do you mean? Anathali took a breath, realizing they'd never talked about the context of that night, only the consequences. Sergio, you were angry before you even saw me. Something had already gone wrong that day. What was it? He was quiet for a long moment, remembering. My father. He'd called that afternoon to tell me he was cutting me out of his will, said he was leaving everything to free clinics instead, because at least they remembered what medicine was supposed to be about. Sergio ran his free hand through his hair. I was furious. At him, at myself, at the fact that no matter how successful I became, I could never earn his respect. So, you took it out on me. So, I took it out on someone who was actually doing the work I'd forgotten how to do. His voice was full of self-recrimination. Anna, I humiliated you because you represented everything I'd stopped being, and I hated myself for it. Before she could respond, Dr. Martinez appeared in the waiting area, still in surgical scrubs. Both Anathali and Sergio stood immediately. Mr. Folden, your father is stable. The surgery was more extensive than we initially thought, quadruple bypass, but he came through it well. He's strong. Relief flooded Sergio's face. Can I see him? In about an hour, once he's settled in ICU. He'll be sedated for the rest of the night. After Dr. Martinez left, Sergio sank back into his chair, the adrenaline finally leaving his system. Anna, he said quietly, there's something else I need to tell you. Something I should have said weeks ago. She settled back beside him, sensing the weight of whatever was coming. The night I recognized you at the hospital, when I went home and realized what I'd done, I didn't just feel guilty. I felt terrified. He turned to face her fully. Because for the first time in 20 years, I cared more about someone else's opinion of me than my own success. You mattered more than my pride, my reputation, my empire, and that scared the hell out of me. Why? Because the last time I let someone matter that much, I lost them. I lost you. And I've spent 2 decades building walls to make sure it never happened again. Anathali felt her throat tighten. Sergio, no, let me finish, please. His blue eyes were intense, desperate. These past few weeks, working with you, falling in love with you all over again, it's been the best time of my life. But I've also been waiting for the other shoe to drop, for you to realize that I'm not actually good enough, that the boy you loved doesn't really exist anymore. That's not... Tonight when they called about my father, the first person I wanted was you, not my assistant, not my business partners, not any of the people who work for me. You, because you're the only person who's ever seen me, really seen me, and loved me anyway. Anathali reached up and touched his face gently. Sergio, you're not the same person who hurt me that night, but you're also not trying to be the same boy I knew in high school. You're someone new, someone better. How can you be sure? Because the man I've been working with for the past month doesn't just throw money at problems, he gets his hands dirty fixing them. Because when Mr. Henderson needed surgery, you didn't just pay for it, you followed up to make sure he was healing properly. Because you remember the names of every worker on the Esperanza construction site and ask about their families. She paused, her voice growing stronger. And because when your father had a heart attack, you didn't call your lawyer or your publicist. You called someone who could sit with you in your fear and remind you that love is stronger than success. Sergio's eyes filled with tears he'd been holding back all night. Anna, I love you. Not the memory of you, not some idealized version of who you were, but exactly who you are today. Your strength, your compassion, your ability to see the best in people even when they can't see it themselves. I love you too, she whispered, the words finally free after weeks of careful protection. I love the boy you were and the man you've become and the person you're still becoming. They kissed then, finally, in the harsh fluorescent lighting of a hospital waiting room at 4 in the morning. It was nothing like their first kiss under the Georgia oak tree. This was deeper, more desperate, full of years of loss and the miracle of finding each other again. When they broke apart, Sergio rested his forehead against hers. I have something to ask you, he said quietly, and I need you to know that your answer won't change how I feel or whether we move forward with Esperanza. This is separate from everything else. Okay, when this is all over, when my father is recovered, when the health center is open, when we've proven that we can build something beautiful together, will you marry me? Anathali's breath caught. Sergio, I know it's too soon. I know we need more time to rebuild trust and figure out how to navigate the space between who we were and who we are. But Anna, I also know that I want to spend the rest of my life earning the privilege of being loved by you." She looked at this man, who had humiliated her, then transformed himself, then opened his heart completely in a hospital waiting room. The boy who had promised to change the world had become a man who was actually doing it, one person at a time. "Ask me again when your father is awake, and you can introduce me properly," she said softly, "as the woman who loves you and believes in the life we're building together. Is that a yes? That's a prove to me every day that this is real, and yes, I'll marry you, Sergio Folden." As the sun began to rise over Manhattan, they sat together in the waiting room, her head on his shoulder, his arms around her, both of them finally understanding that some love stories don't end with the first separation. They just take time to become the stories they were always meant to be. 18 months later, the autumn sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Esperanza Community Health Center, casting golden light across the bustling waiting area where children played while their parents filled out intake forms in multiple languages. The sound of laughter, mixed with quiet conversations in Spanish, Arabic, and English, a symphony of community that filled Anathalie's heart every time she walked through these doors. "Mrs. Folden, your 3 o'clock is here," called Destiny, who had joined the Esperanza team 6 months ago as head of patient services. She still wasn't used to calling Anathalie by her married name, and honestly, neither was Anathalie most days. "Thank you, Destiny. Send them to conference room 2. Anathalie adjusted the simple gold band on her finger, a circle of promise that caught the light as she moved. Below it sat an engagement ring that Sergio had chosen not for its size or cost, but because the vintage setting reminded him of her grandmother's jewelry. She found her 3 o'clock appointment waiting nervously in the conference room. Catalina Rodriguez, a recent nursing school graduate who was interviewing for a position in their pediatric mobile health unit program. The young woman's resume was impressive, but it was the nervous hope in her eyes that reminded Anathalie of herself at that age. "Tell me why you want to work here," Anathalie said gently, settling across from her. "Because my little brother almost died when he was 8, Catalina replied, without hesitation. "We couldn't afford regular checkups, and by the time we got him to the emergency room, his asthma had become pneumonia. The doctor said if we'd caught it earlier—" She paused, composing herself. "I became a nurse so that no family would have to wait until it was almost too late." Anathalie smiled. "When can you start?" An hour later, she found Sergio in what they called the war room, a conference space where the walls were covered with maps showing their service areas, charts tracking patient outcomes, and photographs from community health fairs. He was on a video call with representatives from 3 other cities interested in replicating the Esperanza model. "The key is community partnership," he was saying, his voice carrying the passionate intensity she'd fallen in love with all over again. "We don't just provide healthcare, we become part of the neighborhood fabric. Our staff lives in these communities, shops in these stores, sends their kids to these schools." She waited until he finished the call before entering, carrying 2 cups of coffee, his made exactly the way he'd learned to like it, with just enough cream and sugar to make it palatable. "How did the interview go?" he asked, accepting the coffee gratefully. "We have a new pediatric nurse, Catalina Rodriguez. She starts Monday." "That's wonderful." Sergio pulled her into his arms, and she marveled at how natural this still felt, the ease of being held by someone who knew all her stories and loved her anyway. "Dr. Harrison called this morning. He wanted to know if we're coming to Sunday dinner." Anathalie laughed. Sergio's father, recovered from his heart surgery and officially retired, had become one of Esperanza's most enthusiastic volunteers and their most demanding dinner host. "Did you tell him we're bringing Kehlani and Marcus?" "I did. He's making his famous gumbo." "Your father makes gumbo?" "Apparently he's been taking cooking classes. Says he has to do something with all his free time now that he's not busy disapproving of my life choices." Through the conference room windows, they could see the mobile health units returning from their daily routes, their cheerful blue and green exteriors bright against the city afternoon. In 18 months, those units had provided care to over 15,000 people who might not otherwise have accessed it. "Sergio," Anathalie said, settling into the chair beside his, "do you ever miss it? The old life, the prestige, the simplicity of just focusing on profit?" He considered the question seriously, as he did all her questions. "Sometimes I miss the certainty of it. When success was just about numbers on a spreadsheet, life was more predictable." He gestured around the room, toward the sounds of the bustling health center. This is messier, more complicated. Every decision affects real people's lives. But I wake up every morning excited about the work. I go to sleep every night knowing that what I did that day mattered. He reached for her hand. And I get to do it all with the woman who taught me what love actually looks like. A soft knock interrupted them. Bodhi appeared in the doorway, grinning broadly. Sorry to interrupt the newlywed moment, but we just got the quarterly reports. Pediatric care up 40%, maternal health services up 60%, and our patient satisfaction scores are, he paused dramatically, 98%. 98! Anathalie stood up so quickly she nearly knocked over her coffee. 98.2 to be exact. The only complaints were about parking. After Bodhi left to share the good news with the rest of the staff, Sergio and Anathalie stood together at the window, watching their community in motion. Families heading home with prescriptions they could afford, children carrying stickers from their checkups, elderly patients walking a little straighter after physical therapy sessions. You know what the best part is, Anathalie said, leaning against his shoulder. What? Mrs. Caldwell would be so proud. We took that conversation about Esperanza, dreaming of a house on Mango Street, and turned it into something real. A place where people don't have to dream about decent health care. They can just walk in and receive it. Speaking of houses, Sergio said, his voice taking on a tone she'd learned to recognize, I have something to show you. He led her out of the building and down 2 blocks to a brownstone she'd admired many times in passing. It had been under renovation for months, covered in scaffolding and construction materials. But today the scaffolding was gone, revealing beautiful restored brick and new windows that gleamed in the afternoon sun. Sergio, what is this? Our house, he said simply. If you want it to be. Anathalie stared at the building, then at her husband. You bought this? I bought it 6 months ago, right after you mentioned how much you love the architecture. I've been having it restored as a surprise. He pulled a set of keys from his pocket. The first floor is a studio apartment we can rent to someone from the hospital staff who needs affordable housing. The second floor is ours. And the third floor, he smiled. Well, I was hoping we might need that space someday. For what? For the family I hope we'll build together. When you're ready. If you're ready. Anathalie felt tears prick her eyes as she took the keys. The boy who used to promise her everything had become a man who actually delivered. Not grand gestures, but thoughtful ones. Not what he thought she should want, but what she actually needed. Show me, she whispered. The house was perfect in its imperfection. Original hardwood floors that creaked in places, a kitchen with modern appliances and vintage charm, a back garden where someone could grow tomatoes and herbs. But it was the third floor that took her breath away. Sergio had transformed it into a nursery that looked like something from a dream. Soft yellow walls, built-in bookshelves already filled with children's books, a rocking chair positioned by the window that looked out over their neighborhood. On the bookshelf, prominently displayed, was their old copy of The House on Mango Street. Sergio, she breathed, running her fingers along the smooth wood of a crib that had been crafted by hand. I know we haven't talked about timing, and I know your career is important, and I know... She silenced him with a kiss that tasted like coffee and promises, and the future they were building together, one choice at a time. Yes, she said against his lips. Yes, yes to this house. Yes to the family we'll build here. Yes to the life where we change the world one person at a time and come home to each other every night. As they stood in the golden afternoon light streaming through the nursery windows, Anathalie realized that some stories don't end with happily ever after. They end with happily ever after, and then they lived it. Outside their window, the Esperanza Community Health Center continued its daily work of healing. Inside their future home, Sergio and Anathalie Collins-Folden held each other and planned the beautiful life they would build together. A life where love wasn't just a feeling, but a daily choice to see the best in each other and fight for the world they wanted to create. The first love that had bloomed under a Georgia oak tree had grown into something even more beautiful. A partnership rooted in purpose, strengthened by forgiveness, and blessed with the kind of happiness that comes not from getting everything you want, but from discovering that what you have is everything you need. And in the distance, if you listened carefully, you could almost hear Mrs. Caldwell's voice reminding them that the best stories are the ones where the characters don't just change the world, they become the people the world needs them to be. Would you have made the same choice as Anathalie? What did this story teach you about second chances and the power of genuine transformation? Your participation means a lot to the channel. Please share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment your thoughts. Your participation is very important to us. See you next time.